välkomna till dagens avsnitt av min Lilla Bokhörna. Det har gått en vecka, hoppas ni har saknat mig. Idag ska vi kika på en bok som jag påannonserade förra veckan. Och det var ju Wikileaks When Google Met Wikileaks av Julian Assange. Och många är ju säkert bekanta med både honom och hans arbete. Det är ännu en bok i raden av dem jag inte har läst. Men det borde man. Jag kommer så småningom till den. Den här kom 2016 och det är en intressant inledning här som lyder följande. Och den här lilla trudelutten känner ni ju säkert igen. Headphone connected to the headphones. Headphones connected to the iPhone. iPhone connected to the internet. Connected to the Google. Connected to the government. Det var en liten fin inledning där som sätter tonen. Låt oss läsa den inledande, eller inte inledande kapitlet därför att det är ganska långt. Och här är en hel del referenser som jag inte ska gå igenom. Det får ni göra själva. Men låt oss sätta igång så jag hoppas att ni uppskattar den. Beyond good and don't be evil. Eric Schmid is an influential figure, even among the parade of powerful characters with whom I have had to cross paths since I founded WikiLeaks. In mid-May 2011, I was under house arrest in rural Norfolk, about 3 hours drive northeast of London. The crackdown against our work was in full swing and every wasted moment seemed like an eternity. It was hard to get my attention, but when my colleague Joseph Farrell told me that the executive chairman of Google wanted to make an appointment with me, I was listening. In some ways, the higher echelons of Google seemed more distant and obscure to me than the halls of Washington. We had been locking horns with senior US officials for years by that point. The mystique had worn off, but the power centers growing up in Silicon Valley were still opaque, and I was suddenly conscious of an opportunity to understand and influence what was become the most influential company on earth. Schmidt had taken over as CEO of Google in 2001 and built it into an empire. I was intrigued that the mountain would come to Muhammad, but it was not until well after Schmid and his companion had been and gone that I came to understand who had really visited me. The stated reason for the visit was a book. Schmid was penning a treatise with Jared Cohen, the director of Google Ideas, an outfit that describes itself as Google's in-house think-do tank. I think little else about Cohen at the time. I knew little else about Cohen at the time. In fact, Cohen had moved to Google from the US State Department in 2010. He had been a fast-talking Generation Y ideas man at State under 2 US administrations, a courtier from the world of policy think tanks and institutes, poached in his early 20s. He became a senior advisor for Secretaries of State Rice and Clinton. At State, under policy planning staff, Cohen was soon christened Condi's party starter, channeling buzzwords from Silicon Valley into US policy circles and producing delightful rhetorical concoctions such as public diplomacy 2.0. On his Council of Foreign Relations adjunct staff page, he listed his expertise as terrorism, radicalization, impact of connection technologies on 21st century statecraft, Iran. It was Cohen who, while he was still at the Department of State, was said to have emailed Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey to delay scheduled maintenance in order to assist the aborted 2009 uprising in Iran. His documented love affair with Google began the same year when he befriended Eric Schmid as they together surveyed the post-occupation wreckage of Baghdad. Just months later, Schmid recreated Cohen's natural habitat within Google itself by engineering a think-do tank based in New York and appointing Cohen as its head. Google Ideas was born. Later that year, the two co-wrote a policy piece for the Council on Foreign Relations journal Foreign Affairs, praising the reformative potential of Silicon Valley technologies as an instrument of US foreign policy. Describing what they called coalitions of the connected, Schmidt and Cohen claimed that democratic states that have built coalitions of the militaries have the capacity to do the same with their connection technologies. They offer a new way to exercise the duty to protect citizens around the world. In the same piece, they argued that this technology is overwhelmingly provided by the private sector. In February 2011, less than 2 months after that article was published, President Hosni Mubarak was ousted by a popular revolution. Egypt had been a US client, its military dictatorship propped up by Washington to support America's geopolitical interests in the region. During the initial stages of the revolution, Western political elites had backed Mubarak. US Vice President Biden, who only a month earlier had claimed that Julian Assange was a high tech terrorist, now informed the world that Hosni Mubarak was not a dictator and stressed that he should not resign. Former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair insisted that Mubarak was immensely courageous and a source for good. For Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the Mubaraks were family friends. Under the surface, as a close reading of its internal cable traffic shows, the State Department had for years bet on both horses, supporting and co-opting elements of Egyptian civil society, even as it helped to keep Mubarak in power. But when the US establishment realized that Hosni was on the way out, it scrambled for alternatives. It first tried to elevate its secretly preferred successor, Omar Suleiman, the much-hated domestic intelligence chief. But the State Department's own diplomatic correspondence from Cairo, which we were publishing in volume at the time, provided a frank appraisal of his background. Suleiman was Egypt's torturer-in-chief, the CIA's main man in Egypt, and Israel's approved choice for Mubarak's replacement. For these and other reasons, Suleiman lost international support, and Egyptians rejected him just as they had rejected Mubarak. Never keen to back a loser, the United States pivoted, trying to plant itself in front of the crowd. Its former hesitancy was readily forgotten, and a long, hard road to the Egyptian revolution was spun by Hillary Clinton as a triumph for American technology corporations, and later for the State Department itself. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be at the intersection point between US global power and social media, and Schmidt and Cohen had already staked out the territory. With the working title, The Empire of the Mind, they began expanding their article to book length and sought audiences with the big names of global tech and global power as part of their research. They said they wanted to interview me. I agreed. A date was set for June. By the time June came around, there was already a lot to talk about. That summer, WikiLeaks was still grinding through the release of US diplomatic cables, publishing thousands of them every week. When 7 months earlier we had first started releasing the cables, Hillary Clinton had denounced the publication as an attack on the international community that would tear at the fabric of government. She was, in a way, right. In many countries, the fabric Clinton referred to had been woven from lies. The more authoritarian the country, the bigger the lies. The more a power faction relied on the US to prop up its power, the more it whispered into American ears about its factional rivals. This pattern was repeated in capital cities all over the world. A capricious global system of secret loyalties, owed favors, and false consensus, of saying one thing in public and the opposite in private. The scale and geographic diversity of our publications overwhelmed the State Department's ability to handle the crisis. Threads between players snapped, leaving gaps through which decades of resentment would pour. The tears in fabric of government appeared almost immediately in North Africa. On November 28, 2010, the first cables were released into an already volatile political environment. The corruption of the regime of Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali was no secret in Tunisia, where the population suffered widespread poverty, unemployment, and government repression, while regime favorites hosted lavish parties and looked after their friends. But the State Department's own internal documentation of the decadence of the Ben Ali government began to instigate public anger and calls to action among Tunisians. Ben Ali's propaganda minister, Oussama Romdani, later confessed that our leaks were the coup de grace, the thing that broke the Ben Ali system. The regime began to censor the cables online, further enraging the public. WikiLeaks, Al-Akbar, and Le Monde disappeared from the Tunisian internet, replaced with Amar 404, page not found. The Tunisian publisher Navat.org fought back, disseminating translations of the cables under the radar of the Tunisian censorship system. For 20 days the mood simmered until on December 17th, the young fruit seller Mohamed Bouazizi, driven to despair by corrupt municipal officials, set himself on fire. In death, he was transformed into a symbol, and open rebellion spilled onto the streets. The protest raged over the new year. On January 10th, Tunisia was still in revolt when Hillary Clinton embarked on what she described as her global WikiLeaks apology tour, starting in the Middle East. 4 days later, the Tunisian government fell. 11 days after that, the civil unrest spread to Egypt. The images were beamed throughout the region on unblockable satellite television by Qatar's Al Jazeera network. Within a month, there were days of rage and civil uprising in Yemen, Libya, Syria, and Bahrain, and large-scale protests in Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, and Morocco, and Sudan. Even Saudi Arabia and Oman saw demonstrations. The year 9/11 became one of serious political awakenings, crackdowns, and opportunistic military interventions. In January, Muammar Gaddafi denounced WikiLeaks. By the end of the year, he would be dead. The wave of revolutionary excitement soon washed over Europe and elsewhere. By the time of my meeting with Schmidt in June, the Puerta del Sol was occupied and protesters were facing down black-clad riot police in squares all across Spain. There were encampments in Israel. Peru had seen protests and a change of government. The Chilean students' movement had taken to the streets. The state capital in Madison, Wisconsin, had been besieged by tens of thousands of people standing for workers' rights. Riots were about to erupt in Greece and then in London. Alongside the changes of the streets, the internet was rapidly transitioning from an apathetic communications medium into a demos a people with a shared culture, shared values, and shared aspirations. It had become a place where history happens, a place people identified with and even felt they came from. The US government's treatment of the alleged source of the State Department cables, Chelsea Manning, had been witnessed by a whole world. By June, a global campaign coordinated over the internet had managed to pressure the US government to stop torturing her. The US financial blockade against WikiLeaks had provoked massive denial of service protests from a once apolitical internet youth. Anonymous, once an obscure internet meme, had become a battering ram for the internet's emergent political ideology. In a spectacular electronic intrusion and information dump, sympathetic hackers operating under the anonymous banner had exposed a 2 million a month subversion campaign targeting WikiLeaks and its supporters, including reporter Glenn Greenwald, which had been prepared by a group of private security contractors on behalf of the Bank of America. Barrett Brown, a talented young freelance journalist, had begun the investigative work into this state security axis that would eventually land him in a US prison. Bitcoin had gone from being worthless to achieving parity with the dollar, and as early as June, names like Operation Empire State Rebellion and US Day of Rage could be heard online, the early reverberations of the popular disenchantment that would by September coalesce into Occupy Wall Street. The world was ablaze, but the farmlands around Ellingham Hall slept on. Norfolk was an idyllic setting, but my situation was far from ideal. Pinned there under house arrest, I was at a tactical disadvantage. WikiLeaks had always been a guerrilla publisher. We would draw surveillance and censorship in one jurisdiction and redeploy in another, moving across borders like ghosts. But at Ellingham, I became an immovable asset under siege. We could no longer choose our battles. Fronts opened up on all sides. I had to learn to think like a general. We were at war. Jag håller där. Boken är intressant på många sätt. Inser jag nu med tanke speciellt på var vi är idag i världen. Och många av spelarna som nämns här inledningsvis är med fortfarande idag. Nästa vecka ska vi titta på något annat. Då ska vi gå i en annan riktning. Det är faktiskt den första boken som jag pratar om som jag har läst. Och den heter Konspirationsteorierna och verkligheten. Där Erik Åsard, svensk professor, tittar på ett antal konspirationsteorier och grunnar kring dem. Klart intressant. Så. Det är söndag. Jag hoppas ni får en bra vecka. Ha det gott där ute och så ses vi nästa söndag. Adjö.